Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 9 class. We're in Unit 4, Gunpowder the Sale and Absolute Rule, Part D. European Absolutism, 1500s to 1800s. So this is one of the more important sets of notes for Global 9 because the characteristics and the situations we'll be describing, going over, and exploring in many of these European countries are going to very much so carry over into Global 10. Like this is going to be the scene we start in Global 10, in Europe specifically, and then a lot of the initial changes that we discuss in Global 10 in the first and the second unit of notes are going to be reactions kind of against this European absolutism. So it's very important to understand for both continuity and change. It's important to understand for cause and effect. And it's important to exchange and to understand this for turning points, uh, the characteristics of this age of absolutism in Western Europe. Our self test questions: how did monarchs in Spain, France, and Russia work to increase their political power in the 15, 16, and 1700s? Like, what actions are they undertaking that illustrate to us, historians, that they are consolidating political power in their own hands? These kings, these queens, etc. Two, what ideas did absolute monarchs use to justify their power? Like, why are they claiming they should have all of the power in society? What was their main goal? Three, what actions did Louis XIV undertake to consolidate power in France? Did Louis XIV leave France a stronger or a weaker nation after his rule? You want to be able to explain your answer. And four, what were the goals of Peter the Great of Russia? How did he go about accomplishing these goals? Was Peter the Great successful? So, setting the stage, many European nations had experienced a time of unrest during the 15 and 1600s. And this is due to a variety of reasons. One of the big ones that we've covered in depth already is religious conflict. That, 1517 saw the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, and then Protestantism spreads across Europe, specifically in the North and West. And so you had a series of very violent religious wars. You most famously, of course, the wars of religion in France, a series of civil wars against the monarchs who remained Catholic, and many of the nobility, again, who many of them remained Catholic, against the burghers and the townspeople, many of whom looked to Protestantism to kind of espouse their ideas on religion. And then you had the 30 Years' War in Germany. You had disruption in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, all these different kind of ground-shaking forces of religious conflict. Two, you just had straight up territorial warfare. Sometimes these religious conflicts were really a mask for territorial warfare, that different kings and princes and nobles were fighting over land slash the best land, prime land. During the same period, nobles challenged monarchical power, and this is something that is just a characteristic of feudalism in general, that oftentimes the nobles want a lot of power for themselves, the kings challenge them, the monarchs are challenged by nobles, etc. And the Protestant Reformation just threw a religious monkey wrench in this, as now nobles claiming to be Protestant could challenge the monarch's power if they were Catholic. They used religion as a pretense to rebel, if you will. There were a series of peasant revolts, some of them led by nobles, some of them just ground swelling of peasant support, and that disrupted the economies. You had new technology of gunpowder. This is a pretty big game changer in Europe. It disrupts the very ideas of feudal warfare. The idea of the knight with his lance charging in on a massive war horse. Well, gunpowder disrupts that because a lot of these guns could go through armor. Castles, which had been a mainstay of European geography, these big fortified tall walls and towers, well, they could be quite easily taken down with cannon. And so now castle safety and the power of the nobility with their castles is kind of disrupted. And gunpowder warfare and basically needing to change your entire military outlook, that made war increasingly expensive, very expensive. And what we begin to see is the expense of war is so high that many nobles can't keep up with the newest weapon technologies, the newest gunpowder technologies, And monarchs will seek to kind of use this to centralize power. That monarchs, kings, and queens, and princes will centralize the power to tax in their own hands, kind of trying to take it away from the nobility. And then they'll use that tax money to build up powerful standing armies that increasingly use gunpowder weapons. Again, it's, not everyone has a gun. A lot of times, what you saw is a combination of gun and pike or long spear. And they also need to build cannons to besiege castles. And in reaction to that, we got this picture here. These are the new Tres Italiane, also known as star forts. These forts, these kind of new style castles, but we really just call them forts, they develop as a counter to gunpowder technology. They could better withstand an assault using cannons and guns because these kind of pinions, these points here, offer the defender their own chance to kind of attack the besieging force with fire from multiple different angles. They had lower walls. They had earthen walls, which could better absorb the impact of cannon fire. And so during this period of conflict, with all this stuff going on, what we see increasingly is monarchs and rulers in Europe are going to work to expand their political control. They're going to embrace this new absolutist theory of political control and increasingly try to centralize power in themselves. So, absolutism, we, no pun intended, absolutely have to understand this definition. Political absolutism is a political system in which monarchs act as autocratic rulers. They have complete or absolute authority over the government and the lives of the people in their nation. It's a time period in a theory that says the king knows best and should have all of the power. They shouldn't have to delegate or deal with nobles. They definitely shouldn't have to deal with the people, democracy demanding more rights. The king should have all the power. You cannot question his authority. He rules by himself, autocratic, power of one individual. And in the 15 and 1600s, we saw that monarchs in Europe and Asia will try to centralize power and develop increasing absolute control. So we've already talked about two of these individuals. Akbar the Great of the Mughal Empire in India was an absolute ruler, reforming the tax code, centralizing military control in his hands, opening up new fields of military to different ethnic and religious groups to try to gain loyalty of soldiers and nobles to him. And Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire, again strengthening the military, leaning more and more on the Janissary Corps, which were loyal to the sultans of the Ottoman Empire. He was, obviously the sultan, the ruler, and relying less and less on the nobility in terms of both government and in military might. But these ideas will also develop in Europe as well, and that's the focal point of this set of notes, European absolutism. So, what are the characteristics of absolute rule? And this is a way you can show significance as well as kind of explaining what absolutism is. So, absolute monarchs are going to try to control all aspects of the government and all aspects of people's lives in their nations, from the highest, wealthiest, greatest landowning nobles down to the most common peasant or serf. So the biggest thing that we have in our absolute rulers is they try to centralize power. They want all of the power in society. How do you do that, or what does that look like? Well, if you want all the power as a king, you need to reduce the power of the nobility. These powerful aristocratic people with great deal of land, with castles, with armies of their own, you need to find a way to make them less powerful so you can dominate them, so you can get them to do what you want. More and more monarchs are going to try to make all of the laws and not deal with nobles making their own laws or not deal with the people trying to make their own laws. Centralization of power says the king should be the only one able to dispense justice. So the best way that kings did that is they created royal courts that were loyal to them. The judges would do whatever the king asked and would decide in favor of what the king wanted. Big one, you have to control taxation. You need to control the reins of taxation. You need to have the tax income coming to you, the king, and not going to the nobles. And you don't really want the nobles to collect the taxes because they're going to pocket some of it for themselves. a little bit of corruption there. And so you want to appoint your own agents to collect taxes so the tax money flows to you. And then with that tax money, you are going to build new standing armies. Instead of relying on the old feudal system where you provide land to nobles and a couple months of the year they give you their soldiers, almost on loan, centralizing of power through these absolute monarchs says we're going to build a standing national army, a French army, an English army. And that is going to increasingly use gunpowder weapons and embrace this new technology. And then you've got to create a loyal bureaucracy. Instead of relying on the nobles to run the counties and the provinces, create your own bureaucracy of people loyal to you who are going to oversee taxation, public works, military procurement, all of that sort of stuff. Absolutist kings and queens also want to control religion in their countries. They want to unify their nation under the monarch's chosen religion. So if you are Catholic and a Catholic king, you want to make sure that there are no other religions. No Jews, no Protestants, definitely no Muslims in your country. So all the people follow your religion, and hopefully the priests kind of acknowledge you as the king and say, yeah, the king should be in charge. And so when everyone has the same religious ideology, it makes it easier to run your country. Well, an effect of that, if the cause is we need to unify religion, that means you're going to persecute other religions or other forms of Christianity. Again, if you're a Catholic king, you're going to persecute Protestants in your country. You want them either to convert back to Catholicism or you want to drive them out of your country. And you want to be able to appoint church officials who will back you up in all of this. You also want to control society and culture. Frequently, what we see is censorship. Now that the printing press is invented in Europe, and you see like a massive increase in the number of printing shops where books and pamphlets and newspapers eventually are going to be created, you don't want them to spread information that challenges you as the king. You don't want them to spread opposing religious ideology. And so you're going to see the rise of strict censorship in parts of absolutist Europe. Very similar to what we saw in the Qin dynasty long, long ago in China when Shi Huangdi comes into power and he's like, all right, I don't want any history, I don't want any philosophy except for what I approve. And so he burned books, he burned scholars. You're kind of going to see the same thing in absolutist Europe now, over 1,000 years later. The kings are also going to try to control the people by setting standards, whether it's standardized size of the roads, standardized weights and measures, but also standardized fashion and standardized culture, like what's acceptable, what's the cool thing. The kings want to direct fashion and, in that sense, show their absolutist control. So we've got a couple cool images here. We have, a little bit of a photoshopped one. We've got the painting of the Sistine Chapel, the creation of Adam, where God and the angelic host are creating the divine spark. But absolutist kings saw that divine power flowing into them, that they're in charge, their family gets to rule as kings and queens because God appoints them. A concept we're going to see is called the divine right to rule, or divine right theory. And then we've got this other great graphic. You're probably going to see this either on an enduring issue or a CRQ in the near future. We have the ruler here in the center. They're going to use armies to expand or consolidate the borders under their control. They're going to try to control religious authorities. They're going to limit the power of the noble. And you've got a chain here showing they're kind of chaining these forces to themselves, chaining religion and the church to themselves. They're going to make all the laws. They're going to dispense justice. And they're going to ignore or use assemblies to rubber stamp the ruler's initiatives. And so all of this really shows this centralization of power during the absolutist theory, that all these elements of power flow into the ruler, into the king. So what is this theory? What is the argument kings are going to make as to why all of a sudden they should have all of the power when for a long time nobles had a lot of the power? Well, a new theory to back absolutism emerges during this period called the divine right of kings, or divine right. And I'd like you to star that. That's a term that's going to come up, on your final, on your lesson quizzes, on your unit tests, and it's going to come up next year as well. So again, a lot of this is going to feed directly into our beginning units of next year, because this is the stage upon which Global 10 is initially built. So divine right says the monarch, the king or queen, is an agent of God. That monarchs rule by the will of God. And this makes sense when you consider the Christian mindset. In Christianity, God is all knowing and all powerful. So he knows who's on the throne, and he has the power to remove kings. But if the king's on the throne, that means God wants him there. And so the power of the king is by an extension the power of God. And so divine right says that kings and queens are given their power by God. And just like Christians should obey God, absolutely, they should obey the ruler absolutely as well. If you cannot question God, and Christians don't believe they can, and God cannot be wrong, then you cannot question the king or queen in power. If God has absolute authority over man, so his divinely appointed agent, the monarch, should have absolute authority as well. And we've got a great quote on this from King James I, King of Scotland and England. Et Deo Rex, et Rege Lex, the king is from God, and law is from the king. So you got this chart here, God over everything, who appoints the monarch to rule, who should rule over the nobles and people. And you've got the court painting of Louis XIV, kind of showing him as this divine right king. He is here wielding the rod of power, a symbol of political power in Europe, and he's literally being crowned with victory by an angel, showing that he is appointed by heaven to wield the power over his people. A lot of this art was used as a form of propaganda to try to convince people. I mean, again, you can't quite make these paintings in a printing press yet. You can make woodblock prints and mass produce those. But these paintings were created and put in palaces and put in the mansions of rich people to show, like, no, this is the power the king should have. So now we're going to do a couple case studies and explore the effects and the significance of absolutism in different European countries. So one of them that saw a rise in absolutism was Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella. So Ferdinand and Isabella are from two different kingdoms that were, parts of the territory were called Spain, but Spain wasn't yet unified. But these two teenagers, really, in their teens and early 20s, they marry, and by doing so, they join the two biggest principalities or smaller kingdoms in Spain and make what we consider modern day Spain. So that's united when King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile marry in 1469. And these guys ruled very, very well together. And not saying all parts of their rule was good. There were definitely some negative impacts of their absolutist rule, but they acted as very much a team, a partnership, king and queen together, both believing that they're divinely appointed by God to oversee the strengthening of the Spanish people and to oversee the rise of Spain as a powerful international kingdom. Now, these two are Catholic, and they promoted Catholicism as the only acceptable Spanish religion, right? This idea of wanting to control religion, wanting to unify the people of Spain under only one religion. So they welcomed the Inquisition. Remember, we talked about that? That is part of the Counter-Reformation. They welcomed inquisitors from Rome, from other parts of Europe, into their country and gave them a lot of power to hunt down, quote unquote, non-believers. This included Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and Christians who had like heretical beliefs, basically, who didn't follow Catholicism perfectly. And so the Inquisition did that. They hunted people down, they tortured people, they purged Jews and Muslims, exiling them or executing them or torturing them until they converted back to Catholicism. So again, one of those reasons while these people ruled well together as a team, that absolutist rule might have negatively infected the people in this new kingdom. They built a massive standing army, really leaning on the power of gunpowder technology. And this is really early on in Europe. So there's a combination. I mean, there's still swords, there's still spears, there's still steel and iron armor. Crossbows even are being used. Not so much the bow and arrow, more crossbows. But they're going to lean into gunpowder and cannon technology, which is one of the reasons why they're able to conquer the rest of Spain and drive out Islamic forces and make Spain unified. They are also going to seek new economic opportunities. So in 1492, Christopher Columbus, who was an Italian, a Venetian explorer and ship captain, he asks them for financial support. He's like, I think I know a way to the Spice Islands, to India, where silk and cotton and spices like black pepper and white pepper and cinnamon and cardamom and all these delicious things are. And if I can find a way there, I will make you guys incredibly wealthy. I will claim new lands in your name. And so they approve. They use their absolute power of taxation and money to gift him with three ships and crews. And he turns out to discover, quote unquote, discover, there are already people there, the new world. And that eventually, which is kind of our unit 5 here, so we'll go into greater detail on what that looks like later. But an effect of that will be to bring incredible wealth and incredible power for Spain itself. And Ferdinand and Isabella will use the common enemy of Muslims who still controlled a large portion of southern Spanish territory to unite the nobles. They're like, we are divinely appointed. The Muslims, sometimes they called them like the Saracens, even though they weren't. These people are taking over our land, and we need to drive them out, even though the Muslims had been there for, well, nearly 700 years. Once they had united Spain, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand worked by directing the military to finish what was known as the Reconquista, or the reconquering, a recapturing of Spain from Islamic Muslim forces, which had been there since about 700, 800 CE. And they were successful. I mean, again, this new gunpowder technology makes them wildly successful. You can see like they're unified here, and they conquer the last little bit, driving out the Muslims and Jews of Granada, the last Islamic kingdom. And when they took over Granada, they gave all Muslims and Jews in Spain 3 days to leave or convert or be killed. Thousands of Jews and Muslims, specifically Jews, are rounded up, killed, and or tortured by the Spanish Inquisition, and 162,000 Jews and Muslims are driven into exile. This is a forced migration, and we would also consider it, because they're persecuting them based on their religion, a violation of human rights. And here you have a famous painting showing these Muslims and Jews being driven out of their homes, being driven out of their cities to the coastline, and then being told, like, get out, either convert to Catholicism or get out. And the Reconquista is the focus point of a lot of famous art. You can see kind of here King Ferdinand being depicted as an agent of Christ. He's got the cross here, driving out the Muslims, driving out these enemy forces. And then this is a famous painting of the expulsion of Jews and Moors. You can see all these people lined up, and they're just being loaded onto ships and being told to get the heck out of Spain. Again, a forced migration, violation of human rights. Power and authority here, Queen and Isabella and King Ferdinand, with this absolute power, have the power over the military and the power over the nation to force a group they don't want there out. And the goal, again, is to unify all of Spain under the Catholic religion, one faith. Later rulers also are going to try to espouse these absolute ideas in Spain. One of the most famous of these, of course, is Charles V, who was both the King of Spain and also the Holy Roman Emperor, and arguably kind of one of the last good rulers of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, unfortunately, you can see when he starts ruling, the Protestant Reformation had like exploded in his lap, and a lot of it occurred in the Holy Roman Empire, which was mostly the Germanic lands, parts of Spain as well, but a lot of the Germanic lands. And that's where Martin Luther is from. That's where the Lutherans are. That's where the Calvinists are. And so, even though he fights hard against Protestantism, he's unable to keep his empire intact. He's unable to contain the Protestant Reformation. It explodes, leading to all these religious wars. like the 30 Years' War, like the French Wars of Religion. And so what we see is the Holy Roman Empire kind of fragments and it gets weaker during his tenure as the Holy Roman Emperor. And he essentially ends up dividing this HRE, the Holy Roman Empire. He gives control over Spain to his relatives, and then the Holy Roman Emperor, as the Germanic lands, kind of becomes its own separate thing. Now, Philip II of Spain becomes then the next leader of Spain. He is an absolute ruler, and he's going to oversee a golden age of Spain, or the Spanish Golden Age. Why is it a golden age? Well, we've always talked about you need wealth to spark one of these. And at this point, 1556, when he takes over, there is just obscene wealth coming from the Spanish colonies in South America and Mexico. They have conquered the Aztecs and Incas. They have raided their gold and silver. They have found silver mines. And so, just literally, shiploads of money are being sailed to Spain, bringing obscene wealth. He uses that wealth to build a very, very powerful army and navy. You might remember the Spanish Armada of 1588. And he also becomes a patron of the arts, kind of overseeing the endpoint of the Renaissance in his country, which is why you have so many like beautiful paintings during his time period. He builds a massive standing army and navy, the Spanish Armada, but unfortunately for him, he tries to use that Spanish Armada to invade Protestant England, ruled by Elizabeth I, and that massive army and navy is basically utterly destroyed. So when you sink a lot of money in something and you lose it, that is bad, and that will weaken Spain. And arguably, they kind of like don't recover from that ever. And he also he lost some of his best military commanders. He lost some of his most veteran, powerful soldiers who had been through wars, who were tough as nails dudes. He does work to expand crown control over the colonies, trying to appoint viceroys, people directly loyal to him. He spread the power of his dynasty, the Habsburgs, throughout Europe, engaging in wars in the Netherlands, these kind of wealthy areas. But again, those wars end up costing money as well. He's going to be a leader of the Counter Reformation, and he persecuted or continued the persecution of non Catholics in Spain. Again, specifically at this point, mostly Jews and some Protestants. He limited liberty and freedoms in Spain. He increased censorship. He banned any books not published in Spain. So he wanted only Spanish thought and Spanish ideas, except for the Bible. Obviously, he allowed the Bible because Catholicism. But downside of this absolute control, because he wanted to get even more powerful, he engaged in a lot of expensive wars. Again, the invasion of England, which we know was a failure. The fighting against the Netherlands really weakened Spain as well. And a big thing he did was neglect the growth of the middle class. He really leaned into the nobility and said, like, yep, I want the support of the nobles. They're going to help me in my military adventures. And so the middle class in Spain sees very little support and arguably very little development. You really had this large class of relatively poor peasants in Spain, and then you had these very wealthy nobles and the incredibly wealthy king, and the middle class just kind of withers. And so, because of that, as the commercial revolution, right, we've talked about that, expands, Spain doesn't really benefit from that in a huge way. And so they're going to be slightly behind in terms of capitalism, in terms of economic development, than other European countries, most specifically the Dutch Netherlands, later on what will become Germany, parts of France and England. They're going to fall behind Spain is. So, absolutism in France. This is, I don't want to say the focus point of like this whole unit, but it is definitely one of the big focus points of this unit. We will be coming back to this in CRQs, both this year and next year, and we will be exploring this at depth next year, both absolutism in France and reactions against it. So France has had a very, very long journey. I mean, you remember France descends from the kingdom of the Franks, the Merovingian dynasty. Charlemagne, as the first Holy Roman Emperor, was king of the Franks people. And so increasingly they had seen themselves solidified as one people. The Hundred Years' War between France and England had created an ideal of a French nation, of French people, nationalism, but had led to conflicts between the monarchs and the nobles. The French monarchs in the Hundred Years' War wanted all of France loyal to them. There were many nobles, however, who sided with the English against the French kings because they thought the English who were invading France would give them greater power. Now, the Hundred Years' War does end in France's favor. They basically end up controlling most of their own territory. England is not really successful in conquering France, not at all successful in conquering France. And so there's this brief period of like kind of peace, and then 100 years later, you have the Protestant Reformation and these brutal French wars of religion. You had led to this the monarch against nobles and Catholics versus Huguenots. So it's like this massive battle. Nobles are rebelling against the king, but some nobles are loyal to the king. And then you have these French Protestants, which are not loyal at all to the king. They want freedom, basically. They want independence. They want to set up their own Huguenot Protestant townships and areas of France. Now, the effects of this absolutist wars and these French wars of religion, it will lead to the rise of a new dynasty in France known as the Bourbon dynasty. They begin under Henry IV. If you don't remember, Henry IV is the guy that had issued the Edict of Nantes, which had said that it effectively ended the French wars of religion and said that Protestants, Huguenots, are allowed to worship freely in France and live freely in France. And this Bourbon dynasty is the last major family that will arguably rule France as monarchs, as regular monarchs. They last all the way to 1789, then they get executed, and then they bring back some of the distant relatives of the Bourbons who take control again. Now, the French wars of religion had said, again, the Edict of Nantes, that Huguenots should be allowed to worship freely and live happily in France, and it promoted some peace and stability for a time. Here's the Edict of Nantes again, allowing Protestants legally to worship and live as they will. And so it kind of ends this period of chaos and anarchy where you have assassinations, death, and violence in France. And things kind of bump along for a little while until you have the rule of King Louis XIII. Now, King Louis XIII of the Bourbon dynasty is in charge for a long time, but he wasn't super strong as a king. But he did have an incredible minister, a guy named Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal means that it's not his name, it means that he is a member of the church. He's a high ranking member of the church. And he becomes essentially like the prime minister of France. And so, even though the king is kind of weak, Cardinal Richelieu is hard as steel. And he believes in the divine right of kings, he believes in the strength of the monarchy. So he's going to work behind the scenes and sometimes not behind the scenes, sometimes quite actively, to centralize the power of France into the hands of the king. He believes in this divine right. He believes the kings are appointed by God. And he is going to attack who he sees as the enemies of the French king. Who are they? Well, as a Catholic, he believes the enemies are the Huguenots. And so he forces French Huguenot nobles and mostly the middle class, who were a lot of the Huguenots, to tear down their city walls. He says, I do not want these cities capable of protecting themselves from the French king. And again, these city walls aren't necessarily built to protect France against enemy invaders. They were meant to protect the towns against the king. And so he's like, yeah, that's not okay. And any cities that refuse to do this, Cardinal Richelieu would direct the French army against them and besiege them, assaulting them with cannons, gunpowder troops, until they did tear down their walls, or he tore down their walls. Very importantly, and I'd like you to star this one because I think we can see kind of similarities here. He orders the French nobility that they also have to tear down their castles and walls. He says, I do not believe that you as nobles have the right to have these castles because your castles can just be used against the king to launch attacks and to hide from the power of the king. And so that's why if you go to France today, there aren't really any castles, any fortified castles there. There's forts built by the kings, but no castles. There are these things called chateaus. Chateaus look like castles, but they don't really have defensive walls. They aren't really good at defending you against an assault. And that's what the nobles were allowed to build, is these beautiful mansions that look like castles but are not. Why I want you to start this is very similar to the Tokugawa in Japan. Once the Tokugawa family took control as the shoguns, they also ordered the daimyo, the nobles in Japan, to tear down their castles. Why? To weaken them and to centralize power. Cardinal Richelieu also saw this newly emergent middle class as a potential ally of the king. The middle class is hungry. They're hungry for wealth, they're hungry for status, they're hungry for political power, and they're denied that because, well, they're not nobles. So Richelieu basically says, okay, if you're a wealthy middle class individual and you can prove your loyalty to the king, I'm going to put you in government. I'm going to build a bureaucracy. And he creates this new type of nobility called the nobles of the robe. And he says, okay, if you're an old school noble, if you're an aristocrat, that used to have a castle and has the famous family name and has land and wealth from that, you're a noble of the sword. You were given your nobility through this whole idea of feudalism, land in exchange for military service. But I'm going to create a new type of nobility, nobles of the robe. These are going to be the bureaucratic agents of the king. They're going to oversee taxation. They're going to oversee the post office. They're going to oversee other elements of the government. And they should be afforded noble status because of this. So, really, really interesting guy who believed that he and the king had the right to assault anyone who was going to go against the king's absolute rule. Louis XIII dies, and his son, Louis XIV, takes power. And I want you to take a look. Look at how long this guy is in charge for. He takes power, theoretically, in 1643 and rules until 1715. So he's in charge for, nearly 65 years. Now, again, how much power did he have when he became king? That's a little questionable. He inherited the throne at the age of 5, and there he is in his ceremonial king robes. But we're going to see as he gets older, he becomes, Starret, the best example of an absolute monarch. Like throughout European textbooks and European college courses, he is the model of absolutism in Europe. Like this guy, he does what absolute rulers does best. So, one of the things he does is brutally crush a rebellion of the towns and nobles. While he was just 9 and 10 years old, there is this massive rebellion known as the Fronde. This is a rebellion of peasants, of townspeople, and nobles, and it frightened him. In fact, during the Fronde, as a 9-year-old kid, there is an assault by these rebels against his palace where he is, and like he has to flee as a young child. His mom's running around frantically, there's guards and soldiers running around everywhere, and they're like, we got to get you out of here, there's people coming for your blood. So he remembers this, as a young child. That's kind of scarring to you, people dying in the hallways, hearing screams, seeing fires. He's like, yeah, I do not want to let the nobles and the people question my power and authority. Now eventually the Fronde is crushed, and it's finally put down as he becomes a teenager, and so he then develops this style of absolutist rule where he's not going to be questioned, and he creates for himself almost this new persona, what we're going to call next year a cult of personality, that he could declares himself to be the Sun King. As the sun is the center of the universe, that's what they believed back then, so the king is the center of France. And as the planets and the spheres orbit around the sun, so too all of France, the nobles, the townspeople, the peasants, all revolve around him. And he chooses this sun as his personal logo, his personal emblem, that is put all over royal buildings, all over everything in France. And he basically tried to make this illusion that, like Apollo, the sun king and the sun god of Greek myth, that like he's the new Apollo. And so there's the most famous, sunburst crest of his. This is a famous quote of his, L'État c'est moi. Again, historians argue whether he actually said this, but the translation is, the state is me. The state, the kingdom of France is me. And there's a statue he had commissioned of him crushing the Fronde. He's depicted as kind of a Herculean military figure in his youth because he was only a teenager. And he literally has his boot on the back and the neck of these rebels, crushing them. So really cool symbolism there. And again, he's going to use art, just like we saw in Spain, as a form of propaganda. So, what are the characteristics and the examples of Louis XIV's absolute rule? Well, one of them, and I'd like you to star this, please, because it's going to come up next year, it's going to come up in the final, it's going to come on unit tests, is the Palace of Versailles. So, rather than rule from palaces in Paris, which he saw as dangerous, that Paris had so many commoners and the mob was so unruly in Paris, he decides to build this massive brand new palace complex just outside of Paris called the Palace of Versailles. It was a monument to his personal rule, to his glory, to his absolutism. It's not just a palace, it's a city palace. If you built it today, it is estimated it would cost about $3 billion to build. It has over 700 rooms. It can house around 2,000 people very comfortably. And it has like a whole nother town built next to it of all the commoners who worked as servants and cooks and maids in this giant, massive palace complex. It has a whole series of gardens that you can walk like literally endlessly. It has smaller palaces and mansions attached to it. He's like, yeah, the central palace, I'm a little tired of it. I'm going to go hang out in one of my side palaces and mansions instead. And then a big one, and I'd like you to star this, he forces the nobles to live there at Versailles. Now, I want to be very careful here. A lot of kids are going to be like, well, he's forcing people to live here. This is a human rights violation. He didn't force people to live here with like a gun to their head, but if you're a noble and you want to be politically powerful, you want to be relevant, you had to live here. All right, only by being close to the king, by being watched by the king, by going to dances and parties and meetings that the king held at Versailles, could you be gifted with powerful positions in the government. If you weren't at Versailles, yeah, you were still a noble. Yeah, you had your own mansion, but you and your family, like your sons, they would be cut out of advancement. They'd be cut out of political power. However, this is also used to control the nobility. So write that in, control the nobility, because living here was expensive. You had to pay to live here. It cost the nobles money. Money that the nobles are spending on living in Versailles is money the nobles aren't spending on building their own personal armies. It's money they're not spending on rebuilding their castles and defenses. And he used a right to live there as a reward for loyalty. So if you didn't obey him, he would banish you from Versailles, and you, your sons, your grandsons would be cut out of political power. I mean, the nobility wanted to be in the military. The nobility wanted to be ministers of finance and ministers of transportation and ministers of this. And you could only be those things if you lived at Versailles. So this was a very intense use of location and geography to control power. And you can see a geography CRQ on this, that this location is used to maintain the power and the absolute rule of the monarchs. Forcing nobles to live there or having nobles live there also reduced their connections to their own people in the provinces, making it more and more difficult for the nobles to revolt. And a big one, it allowed him to watch the nobles. Again, all the servants, all these people that work at Versailles were like his spies. You know, there's maids, there's servants, there's people serving drinks, people serving food, people, changing bedding. They're all working for Louis XIV. They're all whispering to his spy master what's going on, who's sleeping with who's hanging out with who's having meetings with who's attending games with who. And, he also allows him to personally watch the nobles. What are they doing at dinner? What are they doing at dances? What are they doing at these big balls and parties he's hosting? And if the king chooses to acknowledge you with a lift of his head and a subtle nod, that is great honor on your behalf. He actually would like bestow honors on nobles, like moving their apartments closer to his own. So if you had an apartment in Versailles, because it's like a big palace cut into apartments, and he moved your apartment 3 doors down from his own, that was a sign of like incredible honor, incredible prestige. You as a family, you're going somewhere. But if you displeased him, he might move your apartment into an entire other wing. You would like show up to your door and they'd just be packing your stuff and be like, yeah, I don't know, you tick the king off, you're out of here. And we're moving you all the way across the entire palace. That was a sign that everyone saw. All the nobles saw the sign that you had fallen from favor. So I would like you to think back again to Japan and see the similarities. You have this Palace of Versailles in Japan under the Tokugawa. They built a brand new palace city as well, the city of Edo. And they had an Edo palace there with the shogun. They too had the nobles live in Edo. They had to go there every other year, right? Sankin Kotai, alternate residency. And that was again done to control the daimyo, to control the nobility. So a lot of similarities and differences. Again, expect a CRQ on this, honestly, in the near future. These are pictures of the Palace of Versailles just to show you the sheer opulence, the sheer wealth. I'd like to point out also, what's paying for all of this? It's tax money. So, the king is basically spending the common people's money on giant statues of gold, on entire hallways made out of mirror. This is the famous Hall of Mirrors. And if you don't know this, back then, mirrors behind them is a sheet of silver. That's how you made them reflective. Glass with silver underneath. So mirrors were wildly heavy back then, but incredibly expensive to make, and just grounds of gardens and fountains and all sorts of craziness. What else did Louis XIV do to control and to be characteristic of absolutism? Well, he's going to work to limit the power of the nobility. Instead of the nobles controlling taxation, he hands over control of taxation, the army, and government in the provinces to a bureaucracy, the nobles of the robe created by Cardinal Richelieu. So again, you have this two different tracks of nobility. The nobles of the sword, they're your traditional hereditary nobles. They were increasingly cut out of government unless they were loyal to him, and they were increasingly excluded from his councils, again, unless they were loyal to him. And the nobles of the robe were these bureaucrats. They were mostly the middle class, or les petits nobles. They were lesser nobles, and they're awarded the best government jobs. And because of that, because they're like, yeah, it's King Louis that's giving me my job, they were very, very loyal to him. And so he creates this bureaucracy of government agents loyal to him. Again, just like we see with the Tokugawa shoguns, who created the bakufu, a bureaucracy of daimyo, nobles, who were loyal to them. King Louis XIV is aided in his quest for absolutism by the Catholic Church and by powerful agents of the Catholic Church. He wants to control religion, and honestly, the Catholic ministers in France wanted to help him with that. They saw in King Louis XIV an ally in crushing Protestantism and driving out heretical belief. And so King Louis XIV is supported by the Catholic Church, most specifically by this guy, Bishop Jacques Bossuet. He wrote papers, sermons, books, all defending the king's right to rule absolutely. And here's one of his sermons. God is infinite. God is all. The prince, the king, as prince, is not regarded as a private person. He is a public personage. All the state, all the kingdom, all the nation is in him. And the will of the people is included in his will. As all perfection and all strength are united in God, so all the power of the individuals of the kingdom are united in the person of the prince and king. What grandeur that a single man should embody so much. Again, probably going to have a CRQ and multiple choice on this guy's sermons. So again, he's basically explaining to people. And you have to remember, like, people listened to the church. I mean, Catholics are like, sitting there in church, and their priest is giving them this sermon, and they're like, oh, okay, so I get it now. All right, so we have to obey the king because the king gets his power from God. Okay, nods your head understandingly, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. All right, cool, 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 cool. So this intersection of church and state becomes a very powerful tool in the Bourbon dynasty and in King Louis XIV's toolbox that they get to use to control people. So, what does that religious control mean for the Protestants and the Jews of France? It's not great. So, Louis XIV is religiously intolerant. He does not want Protestants. He does not want people with other beliefs than Catholicism loyal to him and the church. And so he wants to purge the fresh Protestants, those Huguenots. And I do expect you to know this word Huguenot. It will show up without translation in documents, in CRQs, in other stuff like that. He espouses a program of one king himself, one law, his law, one faith, Catholicism, loyal to the king. So he will set out on a massive campaign over decades of persecuting Huguenots. He starts this arguably in 1681, and even a little bit before that, but it really starts in force in 1681. And it lasts, the next 35, 40 years of his rule. What does this look like? How is this persecution significant? Because this is definitely how you can use in an essay, in CRQs, whatever, to show his impact. Well, he arrests and does trials of notable Protestant leaders and nobles and townspeople. What are they arrested on? Like basically just being a Protestant. He exiles them. That's frequently if they're found guilty of being a Protestant or guilty of whatever crime he accuses them. And again, he controls the courts, so they're always finding people guilty. Like if he's like, hey, I want you to arrest this guy and make sure he goes away, you can guarantee you're not having a fair trial. At times, he would even execute Huguenots as well. And here you have this torture, and you have the priest leading this torture, and a public torture. People are brought out to see this torture of Huguenots. And down here, you can see a Protestant minister is being like tortured and taken out of his church in a basket. Really violent stuff. This also serves to increase the king's power, because if you are found to be an enemy of the state and either exiled, kicked out, or executed, he took your land. So he gets to seize land and property, and he uses that. He sells that to nobles, and he sells that to loyal people in the middle class to fund his wars. Yep, he seizes Protestant churches. He seizes, if you're a wealthy Protestant, you're like, yep, I've got 3 shops, 2 ships, and a couple hundred acres out in the countryside with a mansion. Well, he arrests you, puts you on trial, either executes you or exiles you from the country, and you have to flee. And then he gets all of your stuff, and he can either use it for his own benefit or he can sell it off. And then he uses that money to build up a massive, massive military and fund his wars against other countries. He destroys Protestant churches, ripping them down brick by brick, and he does not allow new ones to be built. So when people are like, hey, this community has a lot of Protestants, and we can't really all fit into one church, we'd like to petition to build a new one. He's like, no, you can't build a new one. I do not acknowledge your right as a religion to exist. He closes Protestant schools, trying to crush their education. Remember, Protestants really firmly believe in the literacy, that every Protestant should be able to read and write so they can read the Bible for themselves and develop a personal relationship with God. So he sees crushing these schools, closing these schools, seizing control of them as a means to destroy the Protestant faith. Other versions of persecuting these Huguenots, these Protestants, he had forced conversions. He would just round them up and literally at gunpoint force them to convert to Catholicism. If they refused, they'd be executed on the spot. One of the crazier ones is the Dragonade system. I'd like you to star this one. This is pretty wild. So this begins in 1681. And what he did is take his dragoons, these are French soldiers, and he gave them the right to be housed in Huguenot homes. So he said, "Yup, it's very expensive to feed, equip, house soldiers. So I'm going to let my soldiers be housed in Protestant homes." And what he really said to his soldiers was, make life for these Protestants hell. Eat their food, drink their booze, slap their kids around, abuse their daughters and wives, just make life hell. But if you converted to Catholicism, they would take the soldiers out and put them in a different Protestant's house. So you saw tens of thousands of Protestants convert to Catholicism because these dragonades, these soldiers, the dragoons, were abusing these communities. Definitely a violation of human rights. And if you're wondering why in our American Bill of Rights it says soldiers can never be housed in someone's house, it's because of this system. Because a lot of these Protestants who tried to get out of this, they emigrated. They left France by the tens and eventually the hundreds of thousands. And they went to England, many of them, which was a Protestant country. And so they remembered this. They told stories of how brutal this system was. And then finally, seeing that this Dragonade system seemed to be working, that thousands of Protestants were either leaving, fleeing France for the Dutch Netherlands, for parts of Protestant Germany, or for England, that he says, okay, well, I don't think there are any Protestants anymore. So in 1685, I'd like you to star this. It's a major turning point. He cancels the Edict of Nantes, this 100-year-old document that said Protestants can worship freely. He goes, no. All right. Instead, he issues a new law, and I'd like you to star it. You got to memorize this one. The Edict of Fontainebleau. This says that Protestants no longer have religious freedom. Because of this, thousands of Huguenots flee. Now, we have to remember the Huguenots, the Protestants, are literate. They can read and write. They are frequently members of the middle class. They're members of guilds with technical skills. They're members of the merchant class. And they flee with their skills and their money with them. Over 1% of France's total population leave. And again, it's the middle class. So we're going to see long term, this actually hurts the French economy as more and more in the next 100 years, like France is rich nobles and very, very poor peasants with no middle class to help drive the economy. And I'd also like to point out that, Louis XIV's lack of religious tolerance kind of sets him apart from other absolute leaders. Akbar the Great, tolerant. Suleiman the Magnificent, mostly tolerant. Queen Elizabeth I, mostly tolerant. So we got a couple cartoons here from this time period. Here you have Huguenots fleeing in massive numbers on horseback, carrying whatever possessions they could on their back, just packing up their whole life in just a backpack and fleeing. Here you got this great cartoon. You're actually going to have this very soon on your Enduring Issue essay, quite frankly. It'll be translated there. And so this is from the time period. This is a primary source document. And you have this dragoon missionary. Remember, missionaries are people that spread religion. The dragoons weren't spreading religion. They're soldiers. This is making fun of them. And they have the cross as the gun. They're pointing at the Protestant. And they're basically saying, sign here, convert to Catholicism, or I'm going to shoot you. So this shows this absolute control of Louis XIV. This shows religious persecution. You have ideas and beliefs, power and authority, human rights violations, all sorts of stuff in this cartoon. So, what then is the legacy of Louis XIV? How should we as historians view him? How should we remember him? Well, we definitely acknowledge that he works his entire life to expand the power of France and himself. He ends up making France the largest and arguably the most powerful military in continental Europe. He builds a massive standing army of officers, mostly loyal to him. trained with gunpowder weapons, like, the famous kind of musketeers. That's during his time period. And they do have the strongest military during his rule. And they end up with arguably the strongest military for kind of the next 130 years. He expands the borders of France through five major wars, and he expands them into areas that make France more defensible. Like, he can build fortifications. They have borders at the rivers on their border that are hard to cross. He places an allied family member of Bourbon on the throne of Spain, making that nation a more likely ally. The Habsburgs no longer will rule Spain; the Bourbons will. And he also funds an overseas empire in Canada. So that's like kind of all good stuff, question mark, that he did. Bad stuff, negative, downside of this rule. He bankrupted his nation, all right, especially the government itself, leaving it really heavily indebted. What caused this debt? His numerous wars. Wars are expensive, and while he did claim territory, like, he didn't claim a lot of gold, silver, or necessarily any resources. He just claimed better borders that are still the borders of modern day France. But those wars sank the French economy. And so the next inheritor of the throne, Louis XV, will find that his government is like basically bankrupt. What else causes this debt? Lavish parties. Building the Palace of Versailles was incredibly expensive. He is wild spending as a patron of the arts on statues, paintings, Versailles, palaces, mansions, and this expensive court life. One of the reasons why nobles wanted to live at Versailles, besides it was a way to get into power and to get into the king's good graces, was he would always be putting on operas and parties and balls and dances and plays and ballets and party, 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 party. All of that was using tax money, you know. But it did make nobles want to live there because it was like the cool place to live. It's like, a lot of people are like, oh, I'd like to move to New York City or a big city because there's a lot to do there. Versailles, there was always something cool to do there, but the cost was tax money. And it's money you're not spending on schools or roads or other things that help your government, or you're going deeply into debt to do this. Increasingly, he and later French kings like Louis XV and Louis XVI will have to force higher and higher taxes on the French people. Um, and what that will do is eventually lead to social unrest. The taxes become so high, they essentially crush the French people. Your average French person is paying 50% of their income on taxes, and they're not getting anything out of it. Like, it's not like, oh, well, we pay really high taxes, but like our kids get to go to school for free. They get really high taxes and they get nothing out of it. His constant wars also made a lot of enemies in other countries. And as they saw France militarily get powerful and claim territory through wars, they're going to fear France's growing power, which will eventually like create alliances against France. So now we're going to turn our attention to absolutism in Russia. And this will be the focal point of the rest of this lecture. So, a little bit of a background, a little bit like last time we were in Russia. Russia wasn't really a country, it was, the kingdom and the territories of the Kievan Rus. But they had been conquered by the Mongols, by the Golden Horde. And the Mongols had isolated Russia from European contact for, a couple hundred years. The Mongols had Khans that had total power. So they have this concept of autocratic rule. And then the other big kingdom that had influenced the Russians, the Kievan Rus, were the Byzantine emperors, who also had absolute like rule. So this idea of autocracy, of having one person in charge, is going to be very attractive to Russian princes, Russian rulers. When the Mongols invaded Russia, they destroyed the main city, the main principality of Kiev, literally burning the city to the ground. Now, Kiev eventually is rebuilt. Kiev does exist to this day as a rebuilt city, but this destruction of Kiev kind of left a power vacuum. and it allowed a different city known as Moscow to rise in power. So, the Russian city of Moscow, which, if you don't know, is the capital of Russia today, was founded in the 1100s at the intersection of three major rivers, the Moskva, the Volga, and the Don. So, it, like Constantinople, was founded on a strategic location. These rivers allowed it access to trade routes. And a lot of trade in Russia was done along the rivers. The princes of Moscow, they don't yet have a king or an emperor, right? Every major city in Russia had a prince, every major territory had a prince. They're going to use this wealth from trade. They're going to use diplomacy, like creating alliances and creating favorable marriages to expand their territory. And when money and when playing nice or marrying didn't work, they would invade and conquer to eventually expand their territories. And they also became like really cozy buddies with the Mongols. And they basically said, hey, Mongols, I know you guys come around every year to collect tribute, to collect your tax money, but that's a pain in the butt to go to all these different cities. How about you let us, the princes of Moscow, collect your taxes for you? And the Mongols didn't really care about ruling per se. They just wanted to be acknowledged as the rulers and be given their tribute. They're like, yeah, all right, princes of Moscow, that sounds like a great idea. And so the Moscow princes became very politically powerful, and they did collect the Mongols' taxes, but they also pocketed some of them. You know, they're collecting taxes, but they keep like 20% for themselves, which 20% of an entire empire's taxation is a lot. And eventually, the princes of Moscow feel like they're powerful enough to challenge Mongol rule. And the first of them is Dmitry Donsko. And he raised this Muscovite army and he attacked the Mongol forces. He won a couple battles. He eventually was defeated, but like the Mongols were like, he's still very powerful, and there's still a lot of Muscovites and a lot of Russians loyal to him. So we can't just execute this guy. Big mistake the Mongols made. So they force him to like repledge his loyalty, but this seed of rebellion is planted in the Moscow prince's mind, and it will flower under third. So Ivan III ruled from 1462 until 1505. So he's ruling for a long time. We know if you're a good ruler, that provides political, religious, and economic stability. And he's called Ivan the Great for the main reason that he kicks out the Mongols. He keeps centering wealth, he keeps centering power into himself until he feels like, no, I think I can challenge the Mongols for control over Russia. And famously, when the Mongols came around to get their tribute, he renounces his loyalty and he banishes them. He literally has his guards pick these dudes up and throw them out in the snow. So he is responsible for ending Mongol control over Russia. He then sets out to conquer all the territory around Moscow, all this farmland, all this rich trading territory with resources such as lumber, some gold, and mostly lumber, honestly, as well as some furs and beeswax and honey and things like that. And he claimed, as this guy who leads this rebellion, the title of Grand Prince. He's like, all right, there's other Russian princes. Novgorod, Kiev have their prince now, but like, I'm the Grand Prince. I'm the head prince of all of the Russian people. And so he begins to rule as an autocrat. Now, there's a bit of kind of a disagreement when the first title of czar is used, but we're going to start using it now. So, czars become the rulers of Russia. It's their name for like an emperor or a king, and it descends from the old Byzantine term of Caesar, which, from Julius and Augustus Caesar meant king. And so the Russianification of that is Tsar. And he is going to base his own idea of absolute rule. And he is going to lead to a long line of absolute rule in Russia all the way until 1917. Again, it's not his dynasty that rules this whole time. His dynasty were called the Rurik dynasty. But this idea of absolutism and autocracy in Russia will be maintained until the 20th century, an easy way to show continuity and change. The next major ruler of Russia is Ivan the Fourth, also known as Ivan the Terrible. Now, I'd like to point out that the actual word in Russian used is Ivan Grozny. Now, Grozny can be translated into terrible, like, scary, but it can also mean the formidable and the powerful. And Ivan the Fourth is an fascinating character and ruler. And you can look at his rule as, yeah, man, holy cow, he purged and killed a lot of people and did a lot of dark stuff. But he also did some stuff to strengthen Russia and strengthen absolutism and strengthen Moscow specifically. And that's why I think it's interesting to know this translation of Grozny can mean terrible, but can also mean powerful. So I'm going to view Ivan's rule through two lenses: as a good leader for like the first half of his reign, and then as a darker, more violent, scarier ruler in the second half. So in the beginning, he obviously is an absolutist. He wants to centralize power, right? He's an autocrat ruled by one person. He's an absolute monarch. He claims the title of Tsar of all Russians for the first time, like that we know of, like in writing. Like he writes to other rulers of other kingdoms claiming, I am the Tsar, I am the Caesar and ruler of all the Russian people. He develops a standing army of pretty much badass dudes known as the Streltsy. He arms them with gunpowder. They carried two weapons as the sign of their office: these big, cool, curved axes, as well as musket guns. And they actually would stick the muskets in the ground. These guns were very heavy and very hard to aim properly. And they would stick these axes in the ground and then use this curved loop in the axe to rest their gun and fire them in big broadsides. And so, using these Streltsy, he captures huge parts of Central Asia. He more than doubles the territory of Russia. So, very powerful army, very powerful ruler. And when cities rebelled against them, he crushed these rebellions utterly. And then he also reformed the Russian law code, creating the Sudebnik of 1550, creating an initial type of feudal parliament where he would meet with nobles, called boyars, if you remember, and meet with other princes and like listen to their advice. And then things take a turn. So here is Russia. There's some paintings of him looking utterly terrifying. Ivan the Terrible. There's his Streltsy, again, the curved axe and the musket, so close combat weapons, but also these guns. You got to remember these guns took between a minute to 2 minutes to reload. And so if things, people are charging you, you get a shot or two off, and then you're switching to the axe for some close combat craziness. And so he conquers all of these territories. Like I said, nearly doubling the size of Russia, bringing new farmlands, bringing new rivers, bringing new peoples, bringing new taxation under his control. Now, the second half of his rule is a lot more violent. Again, granted, he conquered areas, so that's violent, but he's violent like against his own people. A lot of historians have looked to the fact that his wife was killed, his wife was assassinated in a plot that was supposed to assassinate him. She was poisoned, and he loved his first wife very, very much. And she was poisoned by basically a group of nobles and princes who didn't like Ivan's absolute rule. And so after the death of his wife, he was like, oh, hell no, I'm going after these people. How dare they think they can challenge my rule, my control over Russia? So he creates a secret police known as the Oprichniki. These guys are terrifying. He purposely made them terrifying. They dressed all in black. They rode all black horses. They used iconography of like skull masks and would ride around with severed dogs' heads or human skulls on their horses. And their symbols of office were the broom and the dog head. They would sniff out the enemies of the Tsar like hounds, and they would sweep Russia clean of all those who opposed the Tsar. they did actually have guns. They weren't like smacking people with brooms. And he unleashed these secret police on the countryside. They were used to spy on people. They would execute any enemies of Ivan IV. No trial, just show up at your house in the middle of the night. 100 of these guys armed with swords, guns, and axes, assault nobles' palaces and mansions, and kill these people in front of their families. They also oppressed the peasants, and many of them fled. Um, so many people fled Russia for like the borderlands and other countries that this actually caused a drop in the economy, massive loss in productivity. And that led to then inflation in Russia, kind of destabilizing the economy. When towns or even cities rebelled, they were utterly destroyed and burned to the ground. He destroyed the major trading city of Novgorod because he heard, didn't even prove it, just heard a rumor that they were planning to like rebel and remove themselves from Russia and be their own city state. He's like, no. He sends in a massive army of these Oprikni along with the regular army, destroyed the entire city, put most of the population to the slaughter or and serfed them, basically kind of enslaved them. So very, very violent. And this violence actually ends his dynasty. Famously, he had his son, his primary heir, and he had a disagreement with his son's wife, who was pregnant with his grandchild. He pushed his son's wife, causing a miscarriage. She lost the baby, effectively kind of killed his grandson. And when his son stepped in, like, hey, dad, get your hands off my wife, he struck him on the head so violently he caved his own son's head in. And his last son, his remaining son, Fyodor, was basically developmentally disabled. He had a weak, what they called back then, a weak mind. And he was impotent. He was unable to have children. So he effectively ended his own. So these big, heavy robes, these big, long, this is the traditional Russian clothing and the Russian hairstyle of the boyars, the nobility. Big, heavy robes to show wealth, and also because it's, well, cold and traveling, right? They're wearing suit jackets, not like we wear, but. And so he starts dressing like Western Europeans, and he's going to want other people to do so as well. So, one, how does Peter the Great centralize power? How does he control the nobility? Well, he's going to continue to rule as an autocrat. So, he's going to want to have all of the power, autokratia, rule of one. He's going to abolish the traditional land and household taxes of the nobles, and he creates a poll tax, a tax per person in his kingdom. And he's going to have his own agents, not the boyars, not the nobles, collect that taxation. He wants to control the church. He eliminates the position of the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So, for hundreds of years, the Eastern Orthodox Church, one branch of Christianity, right, the Great Schism of 1054, had a patriarch, a singular ruler. And when the patriarch dies, instead of choosing a new one, Peter the Great says, you know what? I'm the head of the church. I'm not a patriarch, but I'm going to create a holy synod or council. And this council, which he appointed with bishops who were loyal to him, will make decisions that I agree on. So effectively, he seizes control over the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was the dominant church in all of Russia. So he gets to pick religious policy. And, he has so much total control over Russia that the bishops couldn't really rebel against this. Eventually, the patriarch does come back much later, but for a while, there's only this Holy Synod, which takes its direction from the Tsar. Another thing he does is he says, you know what? The nobility who inherit their power and wealth, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So he eliminates the traditional rights of the nobility to like automatically be military commanders, to have their own private armies. And he creates, I'd like you to star this, the table of ranks, ranks, ranks. So what he says is, okay, we're still going to have like nobles, but all of them must serve the state. And only through your loyalty to the emperor, me, Peter the Great, and your service, like being good at your job, will you rise up through the ranks. He says, no matter how ancient your family is, no matter how much land your family owns, Every single boyar, every single noble will start out at the lowest rank, and you will have to slowly increase through loyalty and being good until you're eventually appointed one of the highest levels of nobility. And he created three ranks: the navy, general admiral; the army, field marshal; and the bureaucracy, the civil service, chancellor. And so this is going to make the nobles want to be loyal to him because, okay, like, yeah, I have a lot of land and I'm wealthy, but again, like, I want to have these cool titles. I want political power. I want military power. Even if maybe not for me, then definitely for my son. Like, I want to be a family of consequence. It's a big thing the nobles are all about, is being powerful. And now the only way to be powerful is to join Peter's government, to join this table of ranks, to pick either the bureaucracy, the army, or the navy, and to be loyal to him and to be good at your job. That's the only way to rise in power, prestige, and be granted new land and new wealth. Peter the Great, now with a superior military guided by ideally, better generals and admirals, will expand the borders of Russia, adding huge elements of territory. He fights against Sweden, which back then was actually quite powerful, the Ottoman Empire, and smaller principalities, forcing them to join to Russia. He builds a modernized army. Instead of saying, okay, nobles, as part of feudalism, you have to raise an army and join it to mine, he says, no, we're going to draft serfs. We're going to conscript them. So drafting is basically when you go into every village and community and say, all right, I need 10, 20, 30 strong dudes, adults, and they are going to have a professional and educated officers because, again, he had this table of ranks, which you only got promoted if you were good and educated at your job. He developed modern armories, importing experts from Germany, from England, from the Dutch Netherlands, and France. And he said, okay, I need a place to build cannons. I need a place to build guns. And so he developed these modern armories where they're going to mass produce muskets, mass produce cannons. He built the first ever Russian naval base and built the first ever Russian navy of cutting edge ships. Now, initially, some of his biggest expansions, specifically against Poland and Sweden and Lithuania, were not successful. He actually lost his first big key battle, but then's like, all right, we lost a lot of men. That was unfortunate. We're going to retrain. We're going to re-equip. We're going to get more cannons, more soldiers. We're going to drill our soldiers in modern combat tactics, and we're going at this again. And that's what he did. And so the most famous of his wars was called the Great Northern War. This is a very, very long lasting war because, again, the initial battles he lost. Why does he want this war? He is looking for this warm water port. He wants it for trade, for naval power, to support the military, and every great European power had a warm water port and a massive navy. He wants to be acknowledged as a major European and world power. So even though he initially gets defeated, he eventually wins the Great Northern War, defeating his Polish and Swedish adversaries and conquering all of this territory, connecting Finland, the northern coast of Russia, and Estonia and Latvia, and winning territory against Sweden. Even before the war's over, he starts building a brand new capital city, calling it St. Petersburg. He said this is after St. Peter, his patron saint. He's naming it after himself, and he builds it on this newly won territory. This city, like Versailles and like Edo in Japan, was a monument to his personal rule. This city was meant to glorify the Tsar, to glorify his absolute and autocratic rule. It would be a testimony to his power, his brilliance, his westernization. The building of this city did not go smoothly. I mean, Peter the Great just picked an area on the coastline of his new territory because he wanted a naval base there. And he says, yup, build me a city here. The war wasn't even won yet, but he's like, the best way to make sure we keep this territory is to build a city here. And he forces tens of thousands of peasants, eventually 100,000 more peasants or serfs, to come to this swampy chunk of land and carve him out a city. They didn't even all have enough tools. He's like, "Yep, we got to drain the swamp. We got to dig canals. We got to put in support pillars." And they're like, "All right, cool. Where's my shovel?" He's like, "You don't have any. Use your hands." Thousands and thousands of serfs died building the city because it's a swamp. There's mosquitoes. It's not very healthy. There's no good water to drink. It's really awful working conditions. And again, he builds it on top of a swamp. I don't know if you know anything about like building, but it turns out if you put big, heavy stone buildings in swamp, they sink. So they couldn't even just build buildings. They had to start by clearing entire, miles and miles of forests. And they would shave down these 100-foot long trees, 50-foot long trees to make big, long posts. And they would drive the posts into the swamp. Hundreds, thousands of trees driven into the swamp, and that acted as a solid foundation to then build the city upon. And he modeled it after Amsterdam and other Dutch cities that he had been in when he had traveled through Western Europe. And those cities had tons of canal systems and bridges. So he built it to be like a modern European city. It had a major harbor, a naval base, universities, because he believed in education, museums, opera houses, huge, beautiful Eastern Orthodox cathedrals, and a palace, and eventually two palaces he built in there for himself. And you guessed it, the nobles are going to have to live here. And again, he doesn't stick a gun to their head and say, nobles, you have to live here. But if you are a noble and you want to be promoted into his table of ranks, you wanted to have your family be wealthy and powerful in this new government, you had to move and live at his new palaces or build mansions in the city so you're easily able to travel to the palace. So again, he can spy on people, he can control the nobility. So we've got these cities, Versailles, Edo, and St. Petersburg, that act as monuments to personal rule and are used to control the nobility in Japan, in France, and in Russia. Peter the Great also realizes that, like, other Europeans think of the Russians as a backward people. Like, get a look at what these dudes are wearing. You guys know these guys all have these long, filthy beards, and they're just like pieces of food are stuck in them. They wear these long, silly robes, these goofy fur hats. These guys are ridiculous. And so Peter the Great, he's like, no, 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 no. We are a modern Western country. So he passes a variety of laws showing his absolute control that are going to force Russians, and especially force the boyars, to adopt Western ideas and Western culture. So one, clothes, culture, and manners he's going to change to make people, force people to embrace Western styles. One, he says, if you want your sons to be able to enter the table of ranks, to rise up in the bureaucracy or the military, you will send your kids to school. Believe it or not, like before him, a lot of the Russian nobility were illiterate. Not all of them, but they just paid people to be literate for them. They're like, yes, write this down, scribe. And he's like, no, 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 that doesn't work. And not only do we need to know just reading and writing, I need you to know math. I need you to know engineering. I need you to know science. I need you to know how to build siege works and how our cannons and stuff work. If I'm going to promote you in the bureaucracy and you're going to be in charge of taxation, you need to know arithmetic. You need to know charts and tables. And so he creates an educated bureaucracy because the boyars, the nobles, realize this is the only way to get my kids to be successful in government. One of his most famous things he did was the beard tax. He says, guess what, guys? People in Western Europe are not wearing beards. We got little mustaches and clean shaven. These are your choices. Little mustache and shaved, or just straight up shaved. And so he creates a tax on beards. And if you didn't pay this tax to keep your beard, it could be legally cut off. And so here's a political cartoon criticizing this or commenting on it. You have an agent of the government wearing Western style uniform. He's holding this boyar's beard and he's essentially cutting it off. Same thing with clothes. These long Russian robes that they wore, that was the sign of the nobility. He's like, nope, we're wearing waistcoats, which are called that because they go down just a little bit below your waist. He would have his soldiers on the outside of St. Petersburg. And if people tried, especially nobles, tried to enter a city, he would make them kneel in the snow and mud if their robes were long. And if their robes were too long, and if they gathered around their waist because they were too long, and when they kneeled, the extra cloth gathered around there, he would empower his soldiers to cut the robes off at the waist. So he's basically like, you wear a modern Western jacket, or I will make you a modern Western jacket. Um, and it's funny, the beard tax, you could get out of it by, again, paying this tax, and you'd be given a beard coin. So if a guard's like, hey, you with a beard, come here, I'm going to cut that beard off. If you could present this coin, it said, I've paid my tax, I get to keep my beard. One of the things he did is before Peter the Great, when the czar or the princes or the nobles would have like gatherings, it was like dudes only, no women allowed. And it just turned into basically drinking fest. And he's like, well, I've been to Europe and they have these things called like dances and balls and parties. And at those, women dress up in fancy clothes, and so do men, and they dance and they hang out. And we're going to start doing that. And he shakes up hundreds of years of Russian culture by allowing women to attend social gatherings. And arguably, like, I don't want to say increasing women's rights, but increasing the presence of women in politics and society. He's also super famous, and I would like you to star this because it's kind of a big deal. He brought the potato to Russia, and the potato is a game changing food. Russia has a long, hard winter, and then after the winter, they have a brutal wet season of floods and swamp and mud. And then they have another, after the summer, period of mud and yuckiness, wet season. And it makes it very difficult to grow wheat and barley and crops like that at times. And so the potato is not like wheat and barley. It doesn't need perfectly level fields. It doesn't need the richest soil. It gets okay if it's a little swamp. It grows anywhere. You can just literally, you can kick a hole in the ground, throw potato spuds in it, and you will get a potato. I've actually done this in my backyard to prove this point. And yes, I grew potatoes. Didn't dig holes. I just kicked them with my boot, threw a couple pieces of potato in there, and I got potatoes about 3 months later. And they were delicious. They were fine. And so the potato, now able to grow throughout Russia, becomes this major staple food, and it still is. Potato and cabbage, still a huge staple food of Russia today. What else did Peter the Great do to help modernize and westernize Russia? He imported army officers, engineers, lawyers, teachers, and scientists from Western European nations. He says we got to bring Russia up to speed. We got to modernize our technology, our schooling, our laws, everything. And so he basically offered really sweet contracts like, hey, you're a nautical engineer. That's an engineer in shipbuilding. In England, you can design ships. I will pay you triple whatever they're paying you to come to Russia. I'll put you up in a fancy mansion. You're going to teach at one of my locally newly created universities. You're going to teach Russians how to be naval engineers. And he'd do the same thing with law, teaching science, gun making, all sorts of stuff. He westernized schools and universities, modeling them on European standards and building new ones. He created the first ever Russian newspaper, which he used as a form of propaganda, and brought the first printing press to Russia. So you're like, well, Mr. Campbell, I thought the printing press was invented in the 1450s in Europe. Yeah, and the Russians had just ignored them for 200 years. They're like, nah, we'll just still write everything by hand. So he brings in the first printing press and starts mass producing newspapers. He builds the first ever modern navy for Russia and an army of conscripts, which was the style more and more that you saw in Europe. He creates workshops, metalworks, armories, shipyards, and a modern bureaucracy. And so Russia becomes powerful. He is successful. That Russia is a major, dominant, militarily powerful force. Because of these things, Peter the Great is often considered the father of modern Russia in terms of making them a true world power. And while successful and popular later, not all of his reforms during his life were popular. The boyars who didn't want to join this new system, church officials who saw him controlling the entirety of the church as negative, as against the will of God, they conspired to kill Peter and to replace him, to overthrow Peter with his son Alexei. And Peter the Great finds out about this and has his son arrested and interrogated, i.e., tortured. And his son, his heir, dies of these injuries and exposure to like dungeons, which were damp and yucky. Another negative of Peter the Great, besides also like killing lots of peasants building his city, St. Petersburg, is all of these changes, the workshops, the modernization, all of this was done by the Tsar. It was funded by the Tsar. And so what you saw is this economic activity then begins to rely on the Tsar for funding it. And so, a criticism of Peter the Great is that he didn't allow a middle class to develop naturally. Because he wanted to control all aspects of society, he didn't allow enough freedoms for like true capitalism to take off. That you instead of having the monarch, the czar invest in workshops and stuff, in capitalism you would want people, you'd want merchants, you want capitalists, you want wealthy people to invest in stuff. And that doesn't really take off hugely in his reign because the czar was funding everything. And so, because natural capitalism doesn't truly develop in Russia, though he jumpstarts them as a modern nation, it's not necessarily super sustainable. And that is a criticism of his. These are just some funny things on, absolutism as a whole. That political cartoons, whatever. Your new press secretary, sire. Wow, you're not as tall as I thought you'd be, nor as forgiving as I thought I'd be. And then the guy goes in jail. So don't cross the czar, the king, the whatever. That's all we have. Thank you for joining me.